building that collapsed, and this is Rana Plaza. And the incident occurred in April 24, and it was an 8-story commercial building which was situated in Savar, which is a place outside Dhaka. It's a sub-district of Dhaka. This building housed 5 garment factories, a bank, a few apartments, and several other shops. When cracks were noticed on the walls the day before the incident, the banks were closed down, the apartments and the offices were closed down. The only people who were told to stay back were the workers of the 5 factories in the building. When they resisted this order to stay, they were told that they would be denied their monthly payments and their overtime payments. Eventually what happened was that there was a loss of 1,134 lives and over 2,500 people injured. The search for the dead or the alive ended on May 13, 2013. I was there at Dhaka at the time of the incident, and it was obvious that this was a case of systemic failure. The building was illegally constructed on faulty land. Part of the plot was a pond that was covered with rubbish. This site was fit for only up to 3 stories, but was built into an 8-story building with the 9th floor in construction. A week into the disaster, factory owners could not produce a figure of how many were in the building at the time of the disaster. Experts now say the building was not fit at all to house factories at all. It was only fit to have small shops that did not carry heavy production equipment. Besides death, there were people critically injured. And it also meant that there were a lot of people missing because there weren't any data on how many people were there in the building at the time of the incident. And this is what happened. There were lots of people looking for their families and their loved ones, and there were no answers to that. 9 days into the incident, there were no figures from the BGME, which is the Bangladesh Association, Exports Association for Garments. The dead people, most of them were placed at a school ground. And as you can see, there are people in the background. You can see that they're covering their mouths because of the smell that came out of these bodies. This goes on to show that there was a lot of time spent behind bringing out these bodies. There was a lot of time spent behind removing bodies and rescuing people that could have been saved if there was a better structure in place. And this woman is one of the victims. There were a lot of women, because of the fact that garments factories and the garment industry is heavily in Bangladesh reliant upon women laborers. There were a lot of women like her who had no jobs, who were injured, who had no compensation, in trouble because of the fact that they became worthless burdens to families where they were previously breadwinners. The aftermath of this incident also resulted in people like this fellow. His name is Sharmin Ahmed, and there were around 500 people like him. Most of them were local people, not rescuers and not the government officials or the public services like the fire and the emergency services. And these people are not being rehabilitated properly. To tell the truth, there is very little funds available to have more psychiatric help. And as of yet, given the various, which we will discuss later, given the various funds being brought into the scene and being provided, most of them coming from the factory owners, They're not going to be funding for rehabilitation or post-traumatic disorders. At this point, it is also important to ask, why put at risk the lives of 300 plus people in the face of impending disasters for production to go on? The global RMG market has put Bangladesh on the map as the second largest RMG exporter and the cheapest provider of fashionable clothes at prices 3 times less than that of China, which is the largest RMG exporter. This also means it is under pressure to produce and deliver on time, despite political unrest, poor infrastructure, and lack of resources, much of which it has to import. In a competitive market like the fashion industry, it can't really afford to delay production deadlines for the safety concerns of its cheapest and abundant resource, people. Shortage of land prompted many factory owners to convert hundreds of residential and other buildings to makeshift garment factories to keep up with the demand from retailers. Additional floors often are hastily added without reference to fire and other building codes, especially regulations that retailers and buyers until recently had not been concerned with. So this is the case of the $20 billion profit a year ready-made garment industry in Bangladesh, and it is responsible for 60% of the exports, 13% of the country's GDP, and many loss of lives and livelihood. To put it plainly, the infamously low wages, unsafe working conditions, restrictions and repression of labor unions that plague the industry is its competitive edge. There is no other way that the RMG industry in Bangladesh can cut costs and maintain such cheap price rates of clothes. So when talking about the real cost of a $10 dress, it seems to be the lives of laborers. Having said that, how bad should the retailers and the consumers in the West feel? Delving in the question of feeling too guilty, as costs in the developing world are much lower, we should not be expecting them to make the same wages or income. This brings me to my next slide. How much does it cost to make a denim shirt in Bangladesh versus the US? When you look at the figures, we can see that it costs $13.22 in the US, and that same shirt, if you make it in Bangladesh, it will only cost $3.72. More interestingly, if you look at the labor cost, it costs around $7.47 in the US, and it costs $0.22 in Bangladesh. That means 33 times the same amount that you would have to pay if you made it in your own country. On the point of feeling too guilty, Rana Plaza was not the first RMG disaster that resulted in casualties. In 2005, the collapse of the Spectrum sweaters resulted in the loss of 64 lives. In 2006, a fire at KTS Textiles resulted in 54 deaths. In the same year, the collapse of the Phoenix garment resulted in 25 deaths. In 2012, a fire in Tazareen Fashions claimed 112 lives. And this October, a fire in Aswad Composite Mills resulted in 8 deaths. It was just the international anger was not quite enough to have brands change their ways. Many brands and retailers who were sourcing from 5 factories at Rana Plaza remained silent about their link to the factory until tags were recovered on the site. This lack of transparency remained a barrier to ensuring that victims of this collapse received compensation they deserved. In some cases, these brands did not even know where their produce had been outsourced to, because they had left it to their middleman to find cheap suppliers. In September, 28 brands supplied by Rana Plaza were invited to meet about long-term compensation plans for victims, but only 9 showed up according to the Industrial All Global Union, which coordinated the talks chaired by the International Labour Organization, ILO. Moreover, only 2 agreed to sign the proposed long-term compensation plan. The Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh is a 5-year legally binding agreement between International Labour Organization, non-governmental organizations, and retailers engaged in the textile industry to maintain minimum safety standards in Bangladesh. It was drafted only a few weeks ago, even though the RMG industry in Bangladesh is almost 13 years old. US retail giants opposed the so-called Accord on fire and building safety because it would set a precedent of binding commitments and union representation, potentially exposing them to lawsuits. So a group of 17 major North American retailers, calling themselves the Alliance for Bangladesh Worker Safety, announced that Bangladesh Worker Safety Initiative would have its own separate set of rules. The initiative drew criticism from labor groups who complained that it was less stringent than the Accord that lacked legally binding commitments to pay for improvements. The Bangladesh government, and this is where we go into our next slide, asking the question of who really is responsible. The Bangladesh government appointed a wage board that recommended a minimum monthly wage of $66 for the ready-made garment factory workers. But what we see is that the producers and owners of these factories have said that they could accept only 20% hike on the present salary and nothing beyond, claiming that this would ruin profitability at a time when global markets are getting increasingly competitive. The minimum wage for a worker was raised to $36 from $20.6 in 2010. It has remained the same since then, triggering violent protests by workers and criticism by national and international rights bodies who describe the pay as unlivable. We are waiting for news for that proposal to be passed. On that note, I would ask you, the audience, to look at this slide and think about Rana Plaza and tell me maybe at some point in time what these images hold to you. Thank you.